Hello, glad to see you on my channel. I really value it. And today I want to share with you a wonderful story. It's a dramatic story that will come as a total shock to everybody. It is a really amazing story. So enjoy watching it.
It happened at an hour when the roosters had not yet crowed over the village of Pompeii. The sun was still just hinting at its readiness to rise above the horizon, illuminating its azure with faded gold, and the dew thickly covered both the flood meadow by the river and the burdocks in the vegetable garden. "Come on, let's go." John held his young wife's hand tightly and pulled her out of the hay and into the yard. The young woman stood like a broken doll and did not want to go anywhere. And how good she was even now, after a sleepless night. Seeing such girls as Julia, artists begin to paint pictures, poets to compose poems, and ordinary men just strangely, sweetly pinches the heart and want to open their arms and hide in them such a pure, bright beauty. Tall, but not a heron. Thin, but there is an appetizing stanza. Silky, flaxen-toned hair flowed in a natural lush wave up to the ass. On the face a scattering of freckles at any time of year, so harmoniously emphasizing the unusual color of the girl's eyes, seemingly brown, dark, and in the iris embedded amber yellow, in the color of the eyes of a cat wild lynx. "Please don't," Julia said quietly and sniffed her nose. "Forgive me, please." John hummed forgive, well, of course. And maybe a hug and a kiss too. That he, after what she'd done to him last night, would stay with her for one more minute. No way, not a chance. So the newlywed was dragged out into the courtyard as she was in her shirt and lace robe. "Yesterday, we had a wedding. Noisy, rustic, cheerful. Everyone was celebrating and knew it would be a memorable wedding, because it wasn't just neighbors who got married, but characters of note." John was new to Pompeii. As a newcomer, his father here kept a very profitable farm, where he grew all sorts of vegetables and sold them very profitable in the nearby cities. In general, of course, he could not compete with the mega-giant farmers, but he took, as they say, not quantity, but quality, and also about tomatoes, pumpkins, daikon, fashionable Japanese radish, and other vegetables. It was known that they are grown in an environmentally friendly way without any pesticides and herbicides, growth hormones. Many villagers worked for Jacob and did not complain because he paid normally and on time. He was a simple man, though as they said he was already a millionaire. And even if someone in the village had a need, he always helped. For example, he helped the Stoney family with a large number of children with their car when it broke down so that it could not be repaired, and old Mickey and Maria Petrov, in honor of their wedding anniversary and as a gift, installed an automatic irrigation system in their vegetable garden. In general, Jacob's business was going well, but his personal life did not go well. The only woman he loved left him and chose another man, not so attached to the land, and she took his son Jonah. Jacob saw his son only when his wife allowed it and, accordingly, could have little influence on his upbringing. And then Jacob Sobolev died. He was not old yet, and he was not 60, but only a blood clot broke off, and, in general, instantly. He fell down near his new greenhouse and never got up again. The whole world saw Jacob off for the last time, and then they wondered how things would go from now on. And soon the heir appeared, John, 25 years old. They had never seen him in the village before, because he and his father were only in contact when Jacob went out. John, because the people literally demanded to know how things were going to go on, said that his father had been doing things wrong and that he would redo everything. And that was the first sign. How to redo? What? What's going to happen to people's jobs? John said that's not their concern. The village people, in general, by and large, John was not particularly well liked. He seemed to try to get into his father's business, but it was felt that he was as far away from agriculture as possible, about as far away as the local boar producer called Truffle is from the social events in Monaco. But then for the fact that he still tried to settle down, and also because Jacob was his father, the locals decided to give John a kind of credit. He moved into Jacob's house. By the way, it was not a mansion, but an ordinary house, just a very good one. And then it came out that John was going to marry Julia, Selena's daughter, and it was strange and understandable at the same time. It was just that Selena was a very special local, Her parents were the kind of hard workers Pompeii had once been proud of. People who had set such records in the field and on the farm with dairy cows. But Selena, who grew up, by the way, into a written beauty, decided that this is not about her and went to the city to become a model and maybe even an actress or a singer. And in principle, it was clear to everyone that with such an ambition and such zeal, well, not long young, beautiful and stupid to get into the story. And so it was, judging by the fact that less than a year later Selena returned, quiet and with a huge potbelly. Then she went to town again. And everyone thought that after giving birth, she'd get rid of the baby there. I mean, give it to an orphanage. But Selena came back again, with her daughter. A lot of things for her, brought a stroller, clothes, and everything. And although Selena did not share with anyone nuances of her personal life and her parents also kept silent, the villagers had nothing else to do but to think that Julia's father probably does not want to take Selena as a wife, but her daughter is willing to provide for her in good conscience. And yet, the countryman came to the conclusion that Selena had changed very firmly, silent, withdrawn. But what was the reason? They all decided to stay out of the human soul and slowly got used to it. But they still noted the new things that happened to Selena. So since her return, she liked to read not love stories, but serious things on philosophy, history, cultural studies. And in Selena's house, you could find all sorts of mystical things. Dreamcatcher, a crystal ball, brick crumbs scattered on the doorstep and windowsills, a bunch of black feathers in the center of the table instead of a bunch of flowers in a vase. Well, she had all sorts of things in her house. And amazingly, even Selena's parents were fine with it. And if anyone started asking questions, does it bother you? Does it bother you personally? That's the question the questioner would ask, and what was the answer? After all, neither Selena nor her parents had ever said anything that would make one suspect them of being sectarians. Just, suddenly people were a little strange. But it was a special time, the beginning of the new millennium. That is, a time when there was no time to squint too much at strangers and pry into other people's secrets, but to deal with one's own problems. And so lived Selena's family. Her parents retired, quietly fiddling in the vegetable garden. And the daughter, Julia? Oh, what a cutie grew up. An excellent student. Teachers couldn't get enough of the smart girl. But there was one thing about Julia. She grew up quiet. She didn't even have any friends. She played with herself, almost no one to communicate with. And when she entered the age of adolescence and then became a young girl, she began to seem even, well, like a fool a little bit, because she could listen to someone say something for a long time and not answer right away. Because she wouldn't let anyone touch her, physical contact with other people, then her own family members apparently caused her some physical discomfort. But Julia was forgiven, because she was kind, calm, and once she was around, the sun seemed to shine brighter. She was such a special, positive girl. Local guys, of course, looked at her, but no one risked to start courtship. And then, when Julia turned 18, John moved to the village to deal with his inheritance. And what was the shock of surprise among the inhabitants of Pompeii when it became known that he wanted to marry Julia? And Selene agreed. "That's right," said Grandpa Steve. "She's had a bad luck herself, but at least she's made a good life for her daughter." "What luck?" Natalie objected. She and Mickey had been talking while standing in line at the store. "Julia doesn't even know John. She's always at home under Selena's supervision. No, going to the post office and the store doesn't count. No, it's not normal. She couldn't possibly be in love with this John." "Yeah, he is." Natalie pressed her lips together. "You all know he's a city boy, that's all. He's come to play in the dead man's father's business. You mark my words, he's got us all with his, what's his name? Innovative approach. He'll put us all in the world with this approach, and everything my father has earned will go into bankruptcy." And yet the wedding took place. The bride wore a beautiful and lush, like a princess from a fairy tale, snow white dress. The groom paid. Julia was so beautiful. And what happened the morning after the wedding? Nobody expected such a turn. Not without difficulty. But they crossed the street, went down a little down. Not without difficulty. Because despite the rather fragile parameters, Julia's stubborn and kept begging her to forgive, to give a second chance. But John was inexorable. He didn't need such a defective bride. "Good morning." His voice suddenly brought him out of his disappointed thoughts. Damn it, neither light nor dawn, and up came neighbor Natalie peering out of her poly garden, where she was digging in a peony bed. "Hello," she said, and shifted her curious gaze to Julia. "Good morning." John gritted his teeth and took his wife by the elbow and dragged her along. There was the mother-in-law's house. He banged on the gate with his fist. "Selena," he called out, and he looked back. No, Natalie was looking at him with all her eyes. And she was a famous gossip. But on the other hand, John realized that he'd given up his wife. It would be known anyway, and he didn't give a damn about it. He didn't care about Cranberry Top, whose inhabitants seemed to be stuck in their past and wanted to live in peace and contentment, as if time had frozen. But John realized it was impossible. Everything was changing and he had nothing to do with it. And how indifferent he was to the opinion of those who were soon to start talking about him very badly. And moreover, on matters not related to his family circumstances. Finally, the gate on the other side moved and Celine peeked out. What is it?" "Your daughter is a log," John shouted and pushed Julia, who had finally stopped sniffling and was roaring, into her mother's arms. Then, cursing hard, he stomped back. What a nonsense this wedding had turned out to be. No, he doesn't need a crazy woman as a wife. He should go to town today and file for divorce, and then, to finally deal with this inheritance, which is already like a bone in my throat. "What am I going to do with you?" Selena asked as she took her sobbing daughter from the yard to the house. "It's not my fault. I wanted everything to be right. I was just like you taught me." Julia was close to hysteria. She looked helplessly at her mother. She felt betrayed, dirty. She felt just broken. And she didn't understand it all anymore. Where was it right? If her mother was her authority and guide in a vast and dangerous world, suddenly so different, it had to be wrong. Celine sighed and rubbed her temples tiredly. Awful headache. However, in her lifetime, it would be strange if it didn't hurt. You just had to do what I say. And a few houses away from where the mother-daughter conversation was taking place, John was packing. He was just throwing the essentials into his bag and gritting his teeth, trying to chase away the aftertaste of a bad wedding night. No, he wasn't expecting magic from her. But anyway, he just wanted a good girl to marry. Modest, pure, not greedy for material wealth. In short, not like the woman who was his mother. And for the umpteenth time that thought struck him, and yet he was deprived of so little as the right to simply call her mom. No. Katie demanded that he, a barely out-of-diapers little boy, call her by her first name. And at first it was even easy and familiar. But as he grew older, a rebellion was brewing in John like this. Why can't you call her mommy? All the kids in the yard had moms. Simeon didn't have one though. His grandmother raised him, and his mom died. But it was still incomprehensible. Only once Katie went to his side and explained that such treatment made him feel old, second-rate. It was very offensive. But his parents' stern words, backed up sometimes by physical force, quickly helped him internalize the new rules. Jonah had forgotten what it was like to call the tall, coldly elegant blonde mom. He addressed her respectfully as Katie, or even Olia, if he sensed in his childish gut that she was in a good mood. It was only later, when he was a teenager, that John realized why the whole show was necessary. It was just that Katie's guests sometimes came to their posh duplex apartment. Sometimes they would pick her up and hand her a bouquet of flowers, which she left at home, telling John to trim the flower stems and put them in a vase. After her divorce from Jacob, Katie was anxious to get on with her personal life, and she didn't want to add to her solidity, especially in the perception of her lovers, by reminding herself and them that she had a child, which she believed and knew for a fact would happen if Jonah continued to call him mom, which was why she had abolished the word in their family and generally kept an emphatically polite and equally cool demeanor with the kid, as if they were neighbors at all. But Kathy was not an irresponsible parent, not at all. John had shoes, he was always well-fed, he had fancy clothes like his classmates, he had vacations abroad at sea, and when it was time to go to university, everything was paid for. And for all the provision of Joni was responsible for none other than his father Jacob. However, a great spiritual closeness between him and his son did not happen. because John was convinced that it was because of him, his indifference, that Kathy had become like this. By the time he turned 18, John was convinced that he did not love, did not respect his mother. He saw and understood that she was not even looking for love, but for profitable lovers. She was looking for a man who could simply provide her with the lifestyle to which she was accustomed. John's mother had once been what was called a socialite, but not because she had influential parents or anything successful of her own, just that she was still fresh and beautiful then, and had successfully learned to show off wherever she could meet wealthy men, one of whom had once become her patron. Then he was replaced by another businessman, and then there was an affair with Jacob, whom Katie hoped to lure into her net with her pregnancy. It didn't work. I mean, it did, but Jacob turned out to be a hard nut to crack. He didn't want to lavish his wife with money and leave the village and move to the city for good. That's why the divorce followed. By the time John was 18, Kathy was losing more and more, as he not without gloating even realized the competitiveness in this strange market of brides and lovers. Kathy was in despair a little more, and no one will be needed at all. And so, at some point, she married the owner of a chain of cheburette shops on the Black Sea coast, and went there. And the son, "You're a big boy." That was the only word she said to John when he came home from university and found her packing her suitcase. And although the guy had not known close mental closeness with his mother before, but now he somehow felt quite alone. He stayed in the apartment, the rent of which continued to be paid by his father. He continued to study and graduated from university. Then, through his father's acquaintances, he got a job, without work experience, but immediately became a boss. But they fired him just as quickly, because it was one thing, as Jacob was told by his acquaintance, to give a guy a chance to fulfill his potential without going through the startup process for a green newcomer, and quite another to put up with an autocrat and an inexperienced rascal who was lucky that he hadn't bankrupted the company in the few weeks he had been sitting in the office. Jacob said to the son, "No, boy, let's do things the right way." John thought his father was as indifferent to him as his mother. And then Jacob was gone. John took over his business and got involved right away because farming couldn't wait. And at first he seemed to be doing well, but then it all went wrong. Somehow I missed that moment. But even before it became clear that the business, which his father had built and kept afloat for so many years, had come to an end, John decided that he wanted to get married. And why not, he asked. Tired of being alone. Tired of spending his days and nights with girls who were, in fact, young copies of his own mother. John sometimes asked why he got such girls, and he never found an answer. It just happened. And then he saw her, Julia, and realized it was a dream. Not spoiled, pure. She'd make a good wife. So he went to Selena and Julia's house and asked for her daughter's hand in marriage. And even the old people, that is, Julia's grandparents, asked permission. In general, John perfectly understood that in the modern world, the main thing in the consent of the girl to marriage, and therefore, to the very first, he approached Julia. But she, having heard about his love at first sight, replied, as Mom says. So John went to Selena. And then, yes, he realized that Julia is not a modern girl. He was ready for timidity, embarrassment, but not to such madness. This madness bared its teeth and, figuratively speaking, showed its eyes glittering in the darkness when it was time for the first wedding night. "You'll protect me, won't you?" Julia asked. She was sitting in a negligee and robe. Her hair was loose and covered her seductive figure with a silk cloak. John, of course, was ready to protect. He didn't understand, though, from what, but he was ready. He felt like a knight. "I'm so scared," Julia sniffed. "He wants to get me." "Who?" John didn't understand, who was beginning to tire of her wailing about how afraid she was. Julia was saying something strange about how her mother had promised her that she wouldn't be affected by this. What wouldn't? That she wouldn't be taken away. Who wouldn't take her away? John didn't immediately realize it was Arnold. "Who's that?" The young husband sat down on the bed next to his wife. "Oh, just when he was getting hot, and then there you go." "A ghoul," Julia answered, and raised her shining, beautiful eyes to him. "A bad joke," John said. "He's always out there looking for me," Julia said. "And you took me away." "You're not kidding?" John asked, and he felt a little uncomfortable. "Do you know that? Well, vampires, ghouls don't exist." Mom says there are. At least one, Julia said and lowered her eyes. John swallowed nervously. Now that's a twist. What a surprise. To him, his mother-in-law seemed an adequate, modern person without any craziness. A little strange, but on the whole, she was all right. And the madness had settled in his fiancée's head too. And what to do about it, he asked. Julia, he said and put his arm around her shoulders. We'll talk in the morning, okay? Come to me. Don't be afraid. No one will hurt you. The young wife was like a driftwood soaked in cold water from the river. She just froze when he hugged her and clasped her eyes tightly shut, furrowing her whole face. Julia? John called out to her confusedly. Do what you have to do, the girl exhaled, and John was almost torn between two different feelings. First of all, he was laughing, right up to the point of nervous hysteria. Secondly, he was angry because, well, what the hell kind of nonsense from a girl of 18? It's like she grew up in the middle of nowhere in the taiga and doesn't feel anything for him at all. There was also a third deafening irritation and the realization that he had been deceived. It came after Julia added that all your carnal love is filth, once again filth and filth that defiles the human body, and then he is easy prey for all sorts of evil. And the ghoul will definitely come. All right, that's enough. John talked to his young wife for an hour, then another hour and another. Then he made tea and sat nervously sipping it, looking at her gloomily. And she sat with the tragic look of a maiden about to be sacrificed. And nothing good came out of the conversation. She was deaf to his words about how normal everything could be, that he loved her and… No, he was lying. He didn't love her. He thought she was a bargain, but it would seem what's the big deal to say that you love her? It didn't hurt him and he hoped it would help. John even tried instinctively to relieve her tension and stiffness. That is, he tried to kiss her, but she shrank even more and then sighed so doomed, as if he was a ghoul himself and she was his victim. Put me down on the wormwood and do whatever you want. Do what? John jerked away from Julia. He got up, walked across the room. Oh, that's it. Sitting there like a doll, mumbling her nonsense. Of course, Julia is beautiful, and nothing, as they say, did not bode well. But John realized two things. First, he wasn't attracted to crazy logs. And two, he decided he was getting a divorce. Because again, a wife with oddities, which in the statue of marble turns into a marble if you want to kiss her, he was not interested. Amazing still, how during the wedding under the bitter Julia was given to kiss. It's not as if she's been conspiring with her mother to make him suffer so that she could get him to kiss her. And now it was finally over. John packed his things. He got in his car and drove into town to solve his problems as he saw fit. Selena looked at her daughter and realized that she was the only one to blame for what had happened. But unfortunately, the realization of the mistakes made came too late. And I told you it would end like this, said Julia's grandfather. He had just come out of the room he shared with his wife Alexei, used to get up with the first rooster. Back so. Dad, don't start, please. Selena rubbed her face with her palms. And I told you that you're wrong. Daddy, please. Selena clenched her eyes tightly. What had she done? Okay, she was a young fool herself. She got into trouble. But through this, she ruined her daughter's life, almost turned her into a madwoman. And it all started when Selena came to town. Then such were the times rattled among friends' stories about how having only two capital youth and a pretty face, any girl can gloriously settle in life. To arrange a dulce vita, Selena believed that fate favored her because when she arrived in the city, she did not have to sleep at the train stations and sheltered student friends in a bargain rented an apartment. True, only one of them adhered to this strategy. That is, all the riches of the world for pretty eyes was going to get. 3 other girls were going to study to become a teacher, cook, hairdresser, and animal breeder. No way, giggling, said Ariana the Inspirer, when late in the evening they sat down secretly in the kitchen to drink tea. The other girls had already gone to bed because they were following the regimen, studying a lot, worked in parallel. In general, were so right that it's sickening. Everything will be fine with you, Ariana winked, unwrapping a shiny package of chocolate rolls and sneaking tea with delicious things from her friends. It was just a pity to share. I know one person and he knows another. Anyway, Ariana waved her pen with long red fingernails. We'll go tomorrow. Oh, said Celine and gripped her tea mug tighter as if it were a shield. Are you sure it's going to be all right? They say in the papers. They say about the ones on the highway, Ariana said seriously. They are caught by all kinds of maniacs. And where have you heard that they caught even one millionaire maniac? Here, that's the same thing. It's just that there are wealthy men who know how to be gallant. Ariana rolled her beautiful blue eyes and are willing to repay them handsomely for it. Naturally, Selena's parents had no idea what their little girl was going to do in the city. They barely accepted the fact that she decided to enter the theater school. Selena knew the truth would have made both of them heartbroken. Ariana wasn't really her closest friend, but she was the kind of girl who broke all the established rules, who like a magnet pulls you along. She was 2 years older than Selena and as a former promised to teach her all the wisdom of the craft. But later, because right now, as Ariana said, it was Selena's inexperience that was of the greatest value. It turned out that there were men who would rather have fun with an untouched maiden. The very next day, Ariana took her friend to a cafe, where a woman procurer was waiting for them at the table. She introduced herself as Nancy and scrutinized the new girl. She asked her about her life in the village, about her personal qualities, about things that made Selena blush. And then she said that Selena and Ariana could go out together to order. There's a party coming up and there's a desperate need for hot, young girls. Nancy named such a price for Selena's services that Selena's jaw dropped at the cost of so much to buy: beautiful dresses, a new refrigerator for her parents, gold jewelry. Why are you like this? Selena asked her friend when they had already left the cafe. Ariana adjusted her umbrella. The stormy wind was tearing it from her hands. She frowned, apparently thinking it over. Never mind. Nonsense, it was just a feeling. What's a hunch? Selena didn't understand. Don't laugh, okay? Her friend said pathetically, and Celine nodded. My great-grandmother knew how to fortune tell. Well, and as if her gift to me a little bit passed on. And she also sensed trouble. In general, I once did not want to go to order and then like goosebumps on my back walked. The feeling was that in the chest pinches. And what happened? Selena got suspicious. Not paid, laughed Ariana. Oh, never mind. Then I was a fool to go as an individual. And with Nancy, we've been working for a long time. It's gonna be fine. Come on, hurry up. Ariana raised her head to the sky. Let's get to the subway or it's gonna hail. Ariana didn't tell her friend that this time, instead of goosebumps, she felt the cold of the grave and her heart stopped for a few moments. The girls arrived at a party at some country house, and they were somewhat surprised because there were not many people at it, and these people were not really like generous, ready for vicious entertainment men. They were just men in black suits and masks, like those worn at a carnival in Venice. Quiet music was playing in the halls, lit for some reason by candles. People were walking, talking among themselves. There were 8 of them here, but otherwise the country house seemed extinct. And in general it seemed uninhabited, even most of the furniture was hidden by covers. The girls came to a party in some country house, and they were somewhat surprised, because there were not many people at it, and these people were not really like generous, ready for vicious entertainment men. They were just men in black suits and masks, like those worn at a carnival in Venice. Quiet music was playing in the halls, lit for some reason by candles. People were walking, talking among themselves. There were 8 of them here, but otherwise the country house seemed extinct. It seemed uninhabited, even most of the furniture was hidden by covers. And I thought it would be, well, said Celine, who for some reason was a bit scared here. Otherwise, like in the movies, well, when there are receptions, guests. Me too, said Ariana through her teeth, who didn't like it at all. And here you are, my dears. Suddenly the guests parted and a man approached the girls. He was about 40 years old. He was tall, thin, and very pale. He was dressed in a black suit and a scarlet shirt. A ruby ring glittered on his hand. Well, look at them, said the man in charge, and suddenly grasped Zena's chin with dry fingers with yellowish, sloppy, long nails. How good she is. The people gathered around were silent and just stared at the girls. Someone let out a nervous laugh and immediately coughed, saying, "Excuse me." "If someone wants to leave," said the strange man, "now is the time. But remember, if you stay, there is no going back." Well, he continued, when his proposal was met with silence and no one moved. "Let us begin. Bring the nectar of life," the host exclaimed, and immediately a tray with 2 glasses was handed to him. "Drink," he smiled. "Drink up, girls. Help yourselves." Celine froze. She'd heard all sorts of things about what night butterflies did. Ariana had told her, inexperienced as she was, all sorts of things, but nothing like what was going on in those stories. "Thank you, but I don't drink alcohol," Selena finally got it out of her. "But you'll have to drink," the man said with a smile, as if he was a retarded fool. And then Selena, obeying as if a hypnotic impulse, reached for the glass. "Why am I doing this?" Her mind raced, but her lips had already touched the silver edge of the glass and her mouth was burned with a spicy, thick drink. It was like grape juice, and at the same time it was strangely bitter. It had a suspicious metallic flavor. Celine saw that her friend was drinking too. They drained the glasses. They returned them to the tray. Selena was about to ask what was going on and when they were going to work, but then, Ariana, she just rolled her eyes and collapsed to the floor. Selene cried out and immediately leaned over her, shaking her, calling out. "Call an ambulance," she shouted, looking up at the people in the room pleadingly. "Help! Do something!" But they just stared, indifferently or with a strange curiosity. They came closer, surrounded. "Leave her," the master said with genuine sympathy in his voice. "Leave her and accept your fate, child." "What? What are you? What are you talking about?" Selena, sobbing, smeared mascara on her face. "No," she shrieked as one of the men, a tall, balding big man, grabbed her under the armpits and pulled her up. "Poison." "There was poison in one of the goblets," the master explained calmly to the girl. "You could have drunk it, not your friend, but she would have died anyway. And so, if you're alive, then..." His fingers reached for her again. Celine shook her head, but his nailed fingers dug hard below her jaw, pressing on her neck. "You are chosen, child. You are chosen for a great purpose. Rejoice." Everything that happened afterwards became a nightmare for Selene. She lost track of time. She tried to deny her own body, for which there seemed to be no limit to the pain and agony. She longed to lose consciousness, but she wasn't allowed to. It was an endless nightmare come to life. A nightmare that brought to life what she thought were legends, horror stories. But then, it was all over. Selena remembered the light suddenly bursting into the house. Lots of light. She remembered how the bindings on her legs and arms were cut, how her body, which had been lying on the stone altar for so long that it seemed to have already fused with it, was lifted gently. She was wrapped in a blanket. She was told that everything would be all right, except the ones who saved her, the ones who made her tormentors flee. They came too late. Celine had already lost her mind. She thought she was losing her mind, and it was strange, because before Selena thought that crazy people didn't realize their madness. And then a little more time passed, and she realized that the most nightmarish details of what was happening to her, they were real. She was convinced of this after being told that that man, the master and leader of the sect, he had disappeared, just vanished into the forest. His footprints were lost in the swamp, and it was all over. He disappeared. They said he must have died because the nights in the forest were cold, and the swamps were dead, impassable, except Celine didn't believe it. She understood his scarlet eyes too well, and in vain the psychiatrist tried to tell her that it was just the flames of candles reflected on his irises. She remembered all too well the sounds that could not belong to a human being. And in vain the psychiatrist tried to explain to her that it was her mind distorting what had happened. She remembered all too well how this non-human had suddenly developed fangs and bit into her neck, and completely in vain the psychiatrist said that it was just a show, just the actions of a mad sectarian, and the fangs were certainly superimposed. Selena was in the hospital for a long time. She was given some kind of pills shortly after being rescued. But then suddenly, when she started complaining about feeling bad and the doctor looked at her again, there was a scandal in the hospital. It turned out that due to an oversight, Selena was given emergency contraceptive pills with expired expiration date, and they had worked properly. and now she was pregnant. Selena didn't know that her parents had been informed of what had happened almost immediately, and they had visited her in the hospital. It was just that her mind had been so clouded by the horrors of the experience that she hadn't even recognized them. Selena's parents were told what happened. Yes, their daughter had gotten mixed up with a bad crowd. Her friend died, and Selena, apparently because she was a virgin, they decided to use her for the ritual. It was a sect whose members believed their leader was a descendant of Count Dracula himself. He promised them that by sacrificing a pure girl, they could gain unprecedented power and authority. They were all captured, except for the very descendant of the vampire ruler, as he called himself. Theoretically, there was still time to terminate the pregnancy, but the doctor said afterward, since they missed the normal time frame, Selena would never have children again. The parents sighed. They were in shock, but realizing that there was no one to take care of their daughter but them, they held on. The parents sighed and talked to Selena about everything. They said they'd accept whatever decision she made, and she said she couldn't get rid of the baby. Just can't go to the trouble of taking someone else's life after that subhuman almost took hers. So we all went back to the village together, and then they decided that since the pregnancy was complicated, that it was necessary to go not to the small district center to give birth, but to the city. And then something else happened there. Selena's parents and she herself almost went crazy with fright at first. The thing is, a man showed up at the birth center. He introduced himself as Arnold's brother, the cult leader's name. He said he'd only recently found out what had happened. This man's name was Mickey. He said he had no idea what his brother was doing as he was going crazy. It turned out that Mickey and his family had a successful business and were millionaires. And now he was begging to be allowed to support Selena and her baby. Because Mickey felt partly responsible for what had happened, and because he wanted to take care of Selena's own blood, that is, Selena's baby. At first, Selena and her dad and mom took it in a flip. "We don't need your dirty money." But then it suddenly became clear that the pregnancy is so complicated that it needs a lot of additional expenses, and had to accept the help. But they set the condition that they will raise the child themselves. "We can only see him sometimes, and help financially. No more interference, please." Mickey was all for it. That's how little Julia got the necessary things, expensive strollers, toys, and so on. Mickey kept his word. He did not interfere in Julia's upbringing. Sometimes Selena took her daughter under the pretext that she was going to visit her acquaintances, which was said, of course, for the village neighbors, and took her to the city. There they would visit Mickey, then they would go back. Mickey noticed too late the oddities in Selena's behavior and the way she'd raised Julia. But what could he do? Wrestle the child back by force? How? He could theoretically, but to some extent, he waved his hand, thinking that he had little moral right to do so, and brought up Selena Julia in accordance with how her own worldview has changed, turned over the years. The first years, Selena really believed in what she was told by serious people, the same doctor, psychiatrist, Mole. Arnold was crazy. No, he is not a ghoul. But then Selena's attention began to cling more and more often on TV programs, which told of mysticism, conspiracy theories, and all this was found official confirmation. She read about it in the newspapers, and she didn't listen to what her parents said. "It's all pseudoscience. So, according to you, everyone is lying." Selena asked with a sly squint and shook her head, saying, "I know the truth." And gradually Selena began to put special ideas into her daughter's head. The girl grew up on fairy tales. It would seem that what is special about it, except that Selena's fairy tales were often uncensored. They were full of primal creepiness and good in them, one not always. And if other children at a certain point began to clearly realize where the truth and where fiction, Julia grew up with the confidence that the world around is full of everything. It's just that the people around her are so stupid that they prefer not to notice it, because the truth is too scary to know. But Mom and her are brave. That's why they know the truth, and Mom knows how to protect herself from it. "Do you know that this professor is not real?" her father asked Selena when she was watching an American documentary about the history of vampirism. "I've learned they sometimes invite actors to the programs and dress them up as, say, such and such a scientist. It's to make the theory more interesting for the audience. But in reality, it's all just to get people to watch and ratings for the program. Selena paused the program she was watching with subtitles and frowned. You think everyone is lying? Why is it that your truth can exist and mine can't? It's okay. I'm not bothering you, sighed her father. In general, he and her mother over the years, of course, more than once discussed the state of her daughter. It worried them very much, but what could they do? Dragging Selena to the doctors again, and besides, they were afraid that the doctors would not decide that Selena had a diagnosis and would not deprive her of parental rights. Julia would risk going to an orphanage. Okay, Selena's mom said one day, our daughter is quiet, decent, now she's decent. She does not chase anyone, as they say, with an axe. So why bother her? Let her live as she knows. I agree, my father nodded. But Julia, what kind of a mother will she grow up to be? Well, shrugged the woman and looked at her granddaughter, who was quietly in the corner with a book at the age of 9. She was terribly fascinated by the history of Renaissance painting, and Mickey had given her some fancy books with photo illustrations from the city. You know, look, she's doing pretty well in school, right? Well, she's growing up quiet, but maybe when she grows up, she won't drink, smoke, or hang around with boys. Selena's parents feared more than anything in the world that their granddaughter would not repeat the fate of her mother even remotely. And so, watching how quietly withdrawn Julia is growing up, they even rejoiced. And Julia, by the way, did not care. She got used to almost be, as they call it, on the minimum connection with the world around her. Yes, she communicated with people, but she drew her feelings from books, where she could get so many stories of true love and incredible adventures. No, at some point, Julia's natural interest in the world woke up. She once told her mother that she would like to get married, to go on a trip one day. Julia, in general, the more she grew up, the less she believed in her mother's stories about ghouls and the like. But still, she could not completely deny this belief. And then Mom decided to marry Julia off, because Selena decided it was time for her daughter to have a normal life. She can't live her whole life with her. It's just not normal. And who could be a better party for this than the heir of the village businessman? Selena didn't think much about the fact that her beautiful daughter, a barely blossomed flower, was not ready for family life. The thing was that in her 18 years, Julia had a very vague idea of what physical love between a man and a woman was. She was not a fool in this respect, but she thought it was a filth, a vice, an insult to the female body. But she also understood that she had to get married or she would be a fool and a loser. Yes, this is how these views coexisted in Selena's head. She wanted to protect her daughter from the world and to arrange her fate. Julia didn't love John. She she thought her mother knew what was best for her. She even listened to her mother's admonition that she should do whatever her husband told her to do. But she couldn't. As soon as they were alone together, Julia had a nervous breakdown. She doesn't know this man at all. Julia suddenly remembered her mother's story that as soon as a girl loses her innocence, she becomes vulnerable to the forces of evil. And that night, when her young husband reached out to her, Julia was suddenly sincerely, wholeheartedly afraid that she might be visited by the ghoul her mother sometimes said. The thing was, sometimes Selena would have, seizures. She'd have nightmares sometimes when she'd quit her sedatives for a while. And then she would jump out of bed in the middle of the night screaming and start wailing about how he was a ghoul, heir to Dracula. He wanted to find her. He's going after her. Oh, I mean not her, but her daughter. He wants Julia. And so, as a result of such a bizarre mixture of the consequences of upbringing and lack of love and any strong sympathy, Julia could not honorably spend the wedding night in the arms of her husband. That's how she returned home. And now Selena finally realized what she had done, how wrong she had been. In general, she came to this realization slowly. How did it happen? It wasn't psychologists or psychiatrists who helped her. It was just that one day Selena suddenly looked back on her life and what did she see there? Yes, she had a disaster. You wouldn't wish it on an enemy, but there was a family nearby. She had a daughter. And the baby was no reminder of the horror. Selena had loved the baby with all her heart from the moment she first held her in her arms. It was as if a certain part of her life, Selena had worn glasses on her eyes, not just shading, but distorting reality, and now they had fallen. she suddenly realized with a dizzyingly frightening clarity what she had done. She had allowed madness to take hold of her. She had plunged her own daughter into its depths. No, Selena's superstitions had not completely gone away, but they had weakened enough for her to perceive reality more or less clearly. And then, in an attempt to arrange Julia's fate, Selena pushed her into the arms of a man she didn't even know. However, the latter, Selena thought, could have been a good thing, because in the old days it was normal to marry like that at the will of their parents. And many ended up becoming happy couples, but still. So I only have one suggestion, said Selena's father. We're idiots. We've run things to the edge, and there's only one person who can unravel it all. Call Mickey. So they did. In fact, Mickey didn't know about the wedding. He'd been saying for a long time that when Julia turned 18, she should come to town to see him. He promised that he would arrange Julia in the city, that he had qualified acquaintances from a private clinic, where they treat all kinds of addictions, nervous disorders. Daughter, Selena said and suddenly hugged Julia tightly. I don't apologize. I've done too much wrong. But now listen to me one last time, okay? What? Julia sniffed her nose. Should I? Should I go apologize to him and ask him back? No, Selena sighed, but you should go to Uncle Mickey's. Julia looked up in amazement. She just adored Mickey, that man. It was a strange, wonderful feeling, but his presence was always. It was like a fresh breeze on a sultry summer afternoon. Next to him, it always began to seem that the world was not as scary as it seemed. Next to him, Julia became braver. It was just a pity that her mother didn't let her go and visit him often. But now, Julia wrinkled her nose, thinking about going back to John. He's mean, he's rude, and she doesn't like him at all, and she doesn't want to put up with it, so that later, according to the age-old folk wisdom, she can love him. All right, I'll go. And will you obey him? With a sad smile asked Selena, stroking her daughter's head. I will. Selena dialed a number. Mickey answered. It turned out that he had just recently returned from a business trip and was about to call and ask how things were going. Anticipating the storm, but also ready for it, Selena said that she, in general, ready to give Julia under the full protection of Mickey. Let him help the girl as he sees fit. And let Julia see a good private psychiatrist who can help her clear her head about the world, and let her also support her through the divorce process. What? Mickey exclaimed. What divorce? When did she ever get married? Yes, he added, after listening to Selena's confused and brief explanation. It's the first time I've ever wished I'd left a girl in your care. I could have taken her back if I'd had the chance. Okay, she's my niece, I'll help. The same day, Julia left the village. It was in the afternoon, so that the whole street could see how a black SUV arrived and how Julia got into it with one small bag of things. What's wrong? Glafira asked the postmistress. Nothing, answered Selena, seeing the car with her daughter with a look hazy with tears. Just life happened. Days passed, months opened and closed, seasons one after another, and so almost 3 years passed. And during this time, a lot has changed in Pompeii. For one thing, the farm, once so firmly established by Jacob, had finally fallen into disrepair. The locals had no doubt John had destroyed what could still be saved. In fact, the farm was fine. It was only necessary to take it into his hands and not to miss important moments, for example, to harvest and sell everything in time. And then, of course, to prepare for the next season, and so on. However, what did John do? And nothing in 1,000 times worse, as said the old residents of Pompeii, and spit from the fullness of feeling because John spoiled everything. And by the way, people almost went to him to worship him. We've worked with Jacob for almost 20 years, said Sam, who under the old owner was responsible for making sure the land was well dug and fertilized in the fall. We're willing to help and even wait for a paycheck if there are, well, temporary difficulties. It would seem that this is it. It comes into your hands. Here came to you a delegation of people who grew up on the land, the soul, as they say, attached to it. Why not accept their help? But John barked his own, I will optimize everything, do everything competently. I have consultants from the capital with innovative solutions. And how did it all end? The whole place went under the hammer, because bankruptcy. But things were not good at all. because John, while he was farming, managed to ruin some of the land by spilling some of the chemicals that were meant for insect control, but in brutal quantities. Then, he neglected fire safety and some of it burned down. So now the rest of Jacob's property was a sad and heartbreaking sight. As for John himself, he had lost his majoritarian look and had moved from the city to the countryside, but he still had a house. And that one was under collateral. The guy took a loan to repay another loan, which was to repay more loans. In general, everything was difficult and hopeless. The only thing missing as a cherry on the cake was that John had fallen asleep. But he, to everyone's surprise, often walked around just sober and angry. And then, one day in the fall, a motorcade came to the village. Barry was just dragging by the scruff of the neck his two youngest children, twins Seriosa and Petia, who were running away to the lake, where they were trying to catch pikes on fishing rods found in the pantry. Barry had nothing against fishing, but he didn't want the little thing, which was not even 6 years old. So this Valerie guy was almost run over by the lead jeep of the motorcade. "No, what is this?" he shrieked, recoiling to the side. "Look where you're going. This is not for you to race in the city. What? You think you're the smartest?" He stepped closer, intending to say everything in the face of the one who would get out of the car, but froze, as if struck by lightning. Because first the driver got out of the car, and then he opened the backseat door, and from there, well, the first thing Barry judged was the legs. No, they were legs. Slender female and very long, wearing scarlet stiletto heels. Then the whole passenger showed up. A snow-white slip dress, a white jacket thrown over her shoulders, blonde curls, scarlet lipstick. With an elegantly careless gesture, she took off her sunglasses. "Hello, Barry." There's no way, thought the father of many children, that it could be her. "Julia?" he asked, shocked. She smiled as warmly, brightly, and openly as ever. "Have I changed so much that they didn't recognize me?" Barry shook his head, no different, still the same girl. And yet, now it's already a woman, spectacular as her. Barry realized, what is the word for a lady from a glossy magazine or a TV series about the life of millionaires? In fact, not a word had been said about Julia for years, except those rare words that dropped Selena Mold, "All is well at the daughter," at the relative's visit further. "What about you?" Barry said. "Home?" "Not exactly," Julia smiled. "So stop by to look at what I bought. We need to start. There's a lot of work." "What did you buy?" "What work?" Barry scratched the back of his head. "We don't have much work around here. We haven't had a sawmill in years. Jacob's place is a wasteland, and now you can build." Julia opened her mouth to answer, but she was called out. A new character, John, was outside. He had gone out, actually, to go to the store to buy a couple cans of canned goods and bread. Lately, he'd been sitting in the house, which was beginning to fall apart, and only went out for provisions. "Julia?" John exhaled and looked at her as if she were a ghost. "Oh, the wife is back." John's lips spread into a silly smile. He had been suffering from severe insomnia lately and looked like a drunk. "Alexander, the papers," Julia said coldly. The burly man who had been her driver reached into the car and handed her a folder of papers. Julia walked elegantly, lightly down the dusty country road in her scarlet shoes with a model's gait and handed the folder to John. She handed it to John and gave him a shove in the chest that made him stagger. "Here, all the papers for Jacob's household. I own everything now," she said. And then, watching her ex-husband's eyes widen in shock, she added with a smile like a tigress smiling over her prey's head, "And the house is mine now too. I bought your debt. So, you, John, are now nothing and nobody here. But..." And suddenly Julia grabbed him by the collar of his jacket, literally yanked him to her, and breathed out into his lips, almost smearing scarlet lipstick on them. "If you make the right decision, if you're a good boy, you can still fix some things." With that, she turned and walked to the car. "Good afternoon, Grandpa Steve," she greeted her neighbor. Then she waved her hand to this and that villager. Well, just like a queen greeting her subjects. And then Julia just got into her expensive SUV with a driver and drove away with 2 more cars. And the people of Pompeii were left wondering what the hell that was all about. Well, what was it? asked Barry, and the same could be repeated by other villagers who witnessed this extraordinary scene. Only the four dogs Tuzik, who was dragging in his teeth a sausage dropped by someone in the store, the goat Belyanaka, who had escaped from her mistress to have a good time in other people's gardens, and the twins who, anticipating a generous beating from their mother, decided to take advantage of the fact that their father had let his guard down and ran along the same route as the goat Belyanaka. I'd like to get on with my life. Barry waved his hand at everything and everyone and followed the fugitives. Julia, I apologize for sticking my nose where it doesn't belong, but how are you? The driver asked. I'm fine, answered the girl from the back seat. But Alexander saw through the rearview mirror that she was far from all right. Her jaw was tense, her eyes squinted. It's always difficult with exes. Usually Alexander was a little wordy, but here, just as an instinct led that it is not necessary to leave the mistress alone with his thoughts. I remember, I met mine once, and he began to tell me how hard it was for him after his divorce, which was initiated after he caught his wife in bed with his best friend. Julia listened, and at the same time was immersed in her own experiences. Well, what could she say about herself? Well done. The first time she'd seen John on the morning of her wedding night, and she'd done it, and it had seemed like it. Then, a few years ago, when Mickey had taken her to the city, Julia had felt like a quail in a snares, a tiny autumn leaf carried by the stormy wind. She had so little contact with her uncle that he sometimes seemed a stranger to her. And at the same time she was drawn to him, Mickey almost literally radiated light and warmth, and every time Selena let them see each other, it was as if he energized Julia, and she began to look at the world, well, more positively and realistically, which, by the way, her mother didn't like. I'm sorry, niece, I didn't see it coming, Mickey said as they drove into town. It's wild to get married. You should have. You should have called me. I wouldn't have let you. To hell with her trip. We could have waited. But you. Oh well, I see you're not in the mood to talk now. It's nothing. What's important is that your mother seems to have come to her senses a little. Mickey hadn't told Julia the secret of her origins yet. It would be abnormal and inhuman to talk to an underage girl about such things. And besides, in the first place, Mickey feared that the truth, even now that Julia had become an adult, could simply have a very negative impact on her psyche. But now he was quietly rejoicing that Selena had finally realized that her daughter didn't have to live according to her own habits, that she had finally realized that a little more life in such an atmosphere and Julia could be sent to the clinic. I don't want to go home, Julia said suddenly from the back seat, and then added so quietly that he barely heard. I think I'm going crazy. Why do you think that? Mickey asked cautiously. Because Julia bit her lips painfully to the scarlet mark, and only thanks to this burning, self-inflicted pain, kept herself from crying. Mom says one thing, Grandma and Grandpa another. Who should I believe? I think I know something very important, and what I do know scares me. You know, Julia, I'm sorry for you, Mickey said and gripped the steering wheel tighter with his fingers. Maybe I shouldn't have trusted you with this family, but now, do you really want me to help you? Yes, the girl answered confidently. Will you take me to the clinic? Will they treat me? What? Julia, don't you dare think that. You're going to live with me. In the same room you used to stay in, okay? Mickey smiled. His mansion always had 2 rooms ready for the young guest, a bedroom and a living room, decorated in a very girlish style. I want to bring in some specialists, psychologists. They can help you. No, you can't treat for beliefs in personal faith, you know. You did not see ghouls and evil things about which Mom told you in the corners? No, the girl shook her head. I'd never even seen flying saucers, only comets. You're a smart girl. No, it's just that you're confused. Yes, now in the world, many people believe in psychics, Bigfoot, and many other things. And sometimes there is nothing, well, so only you. Unfortunately, all this. Head clouded, Julia finished for her uncle. It's ruining your life. Is that what you mean? Yeah, sighed Mickey. How are you? Are you all right? He didn't touch me, Julia said, guessing from her uncle's confused tone what the question was about. Can I stay with you a little longer? And also, will you tell me about my father? My mom doesn't want to talk about it. It'll happen. I'll tell you everything. nodded Mickey, and was silent for a while. There were more cars on the road, and he, as a responsible driver, decided to concentrate on getting home properly. And at the same time, so some very serious and heavy conversations were postponed for a while. It was time for Julia to start living normally. It was time for her to know the truth. Much later, looking back, Julia did not understand how she had managed to live to the age of 18 in a relatively clear mind. Not that the atmosphere of her growing up had been completely insane, and yet, every day of her existence she was like a tightrope walker who must hold on, balancing on a terrible height. Mickey's society, as always, had a calming effect on Julia, and conversations with psychologists and even a psychiatrist, invited from a private clinic, were not scary at all. In general, I usually do not rush to conclusions for my patients, the psychiatrist told her Billy. But here I can say for sure, don't be afraid, my dear. You don't have schizophrenia. You are, pardon my candor, but except for the dreary superstitions planted in your young head, you will be healthier than many of my patients. So, Billy in his 60s was still practicing and considered one of the best specialists around. Just live the life of a young, modern girl. Study, have fun, stay hydrated, get at least 8 hours of sleep, and fall in love. Well, honey, why are you looking at me like that? Love, can really do wonders and help sometimes where any therapy and pills are powerless. Mickey was lonely, no wife, no children, and accordingly, he lived alone. In fact, he had a mistress. To be precise, they changed about once every year or two. That is, with the same frequency as his personal cars. But he never allowed these women into his inner circle, Julia. And in fact, they lived in the mansion as a small family, Julia, Mickey, and all sorts of servants, but not numerous. They didn't keep Julia locked up. On the contrary, Mickey insisted that she should go out on the town. And to keep her safe and secure, she was accompanied by a guard and the invariable driver and personal assistant Alexander, all in one person. Plus, Mickey often gave Julia extra security because he had once survived an unsuccessful assassination attempt from business rivals, and since then he had been extremely careful. And then, when Julia felt better and when she was finally able to shed the fears of the beyond that Selena had instilled in her, that was about 6 months after her arrival, she and Mickey had talked. He revealed to her the truth about her father, and that, naturally, came as a shock. Julia wanted to go to her mother and talk about everything. Then she spoke with despair that she was sick of going out into the world and look into the eyes of people because her father is a monster in the guise of a man, a sectarian. How am I supposed to live with the fact that he was my brother? Mickey asked her once, taking advantage of a brief pause in her hysterics. What's it like for me to live with the fact that this was once my own man? How does it make me feel to think that maybe it was somehow my fault for not looking after him? Mickey told Julia a lot of things about himself. He was Arnold's younger brother. Their parents were the sort of people who are remarkably good at being in any era and always, as they say, cleverly organized. Both father and mother devoted themselves to science. Historian and art historian with a common passion for the era between the 14th and 16th centuries. That was a special period, and at home there were many reproductions of paintings from that era, skillful imitations of all sorts of antiquities. Arnold and Mickey grew up with nannies and tutors, and their parents, well, they were very busy, and they were very strict. What about the twos and twos, the pranks, the failing grades? No, their sons were obliged to be excellent students, and besides, their parents dreamed that they would follow in their footsteps. One of the most vivid memories of Mickey's childhood was the episode when the 13-year-old Misha had to retell his father some legends about the Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who was famous for torturing and destroying her maids, peasant daughters, and even the daughters of noblemen under her control, all for the sake of staying young forever through black magic. Arnold retold colorfully, in gruesome detail, legends, and then his father began to ask questions on the landmark dates of Hungarian history. And Arnold made a mistake. He couldn't remember one date. Then his father got up, said that you can't be so bad, and without listening to the son's pleas, just took and closed him in a dark closet. Yes, despite the fact that Arnold was already big, he was hysterically afraid of that closet. When he was 5 years old, his parents had once locked him in there all night. And in that closet, by the way, They kept a stuffed hare with horns and boar's tusks attached to it, an anniversary present from a joker hunter who knew the family. And there was also an antique mirror in the closet. Mickey shared with Julie the idea that it was possible. It was the educational sessions in that closet that pushed Arnold to the fact that then he went crazy. In general, even in childhood, he had attacks of aggression, but his parents did not pay attention to it. Then, in the early 90s, they were gone. Mickey decided to go into business. The time was such that it seemed like you could just stretch out your hand and catch millions in the air. But Arnold, he started selling some of his parents' collection. And at some point, apparently, antiques wish to buy people who are fond of mysticism. And then Arnold, through this company, finally moved his mind. He decided that why not organize a cult himself. Mickey was against his brother's new hobby. He tried to save Arnold, but he scoffed, said Mickey didn't know what he was giving up. What was I supposed to do? I was an idiot for nothing. I should have just given up, Mickey said with sincere regret. I thought he'd get over it. And then I heard he got into something really bad, that he thought he was Dracula's heir. And then Mickey sighed heavily and took Julia's hand. She didn't take it away. She just silently accepted the revelations about the past of her family, absorbing them like a sponge, saving them up, not yet knowing what she was going to do with them. And then Mickey found out what his brother had gotten himself into. He was horrified, and he felt guilty and, in some way, involved in the fate of that unfortunate girl, Selena. He decided that he could not turn his back on the fact that she was having a child, a nephew or a niece. And when he learned that Julia had been born, he realized that he had never loved anyone as much as he loved her. She had become his dearest person. But above all, respecting the will of her mother and grandparents, he stayed away, didn't allow himself to interfere any more than they agreed to accept help. But now that Julia was an adult, Mickey decided it was time for her to choose for herself, and if only she wanted to. Julia confessed to her uncle that his company had always been her safe haven. Yes, she loved her mother, in spite of everything, but now it was as if she stood at a crossroads, and she already knew which road to take. And then something surprising and bitter was revealed. It turned out that Selena didn't want to see her daughter. I mean, they'd seen each other over the years, but only a few times when Selena was in town. And then one day, she said the following to Julia: I kept you alive because I wouldn't have any more children. I raised you. I wanted to protect you as best I could. I'm sorry, my daughter, if I've done wrong or hurt you. But now I want to live alone. Just let me live. From Julia, who was going to ask if we could go home to the country for a couple of months of warm summer, Mom. Julia's hands, as they say, were down and her heart sank. But she found the strength to smile and say, Okay, Mom, thank you for everything. And then I'll try to do it myself. Okay, I won't bother you. But no matter how painful it was, Julia couldn't help but admit that during these couple of years spent with her uncle, she had gained much more than in her whole previous life. She was no longer so afraid of crowded places. She had learned to speak freely to strangers and even to argue. Mickey paid for her to go to university, and although Julia was a part-time student, she made friends there. And one day, Mickey honestly told her that I have a big business. I do real estate, farming, and one day it will all be yours. At first, Julia refused to say that she didn't count on it at all. It's not hers at all. She's not worthy and so on. But Mickey then looked at her carefully and said, But I've got no one else to leave it to. There isn't another relative in the world. And so Julia agreed. One day, Mickey told her he bought some land in his native Pompeii. Imagine it belonged to your ex-husband, and he said, Would you like to try your hand as a business lady here? Let's say, in your native land? Julia was a little shocked by such a proposal, but after thinking about it, agreed. Don't tell me you want to get back at that guy, Mickey said with a smile. Though if I were you, he added thoughtfully, not that I want revenge, but you want to show him what you've become, don't you? So he'll see that there's no more of that young silly girl he got easily, like a chicken at the market. Julia was not offended by this humorous description of her own past. From a certain point on, she and her uncle had a very fine feeling for each other and were on the same wavelength. She nodded and said that yes, that was it. That's a good girl, Mickey said and stroked his niece's head. Sometimes you have to say goodbye to the past, even though it hurts, but then you can move on. just the day after John ran into the young wife he had left behind, who had returned as a gorgeous business lady. The whole village knew about it, and almost all the villagers were unanimous in saying that John, a major who had let his father's inheritance go to the wind, had been flicked on the nose by fate. He did not like, you see, something came to him pure, glorious Julia. But the mother-in-law, as they said, did not hesitate to send her daughter to those mysterious relatives in the city. And now, please, life has put everything in its place. Nobody expected that everything would turn out this way. Grandpa Steve summed up the story enthusiastically, retelling it for what must have been the 100th time, and each time, by the way, adding new details of his own authorship. Thus, in his story, Julia's wedding ring appeared on her finger. Then she cast a sensual, longing look at her ex-husband. Once in his story, John whispered, "I love you still," and let a stingy male tear. Another time, John exclaimed, "I don't want you anyway." In general, everyone in Pompeii knew that Grandpa Steve was a fictitious man, but how much everyone enjoyed listening to him. And just a couple of days later, another event took place. New owners came to the village again. Well, or rather a man from them. It was Julia's assistant, a young girl, dressed simply in jeans, a t-shirt, and a windbreaker jacket, glasses on her nose, red curly hair. This girl began to go around the yards and hand out sheets with descriptions of vacancies, which, as Julia promised, would soon be available at the restored enterprise, that is, in the revived farm. People took the leaflets, read them, and shook their heads incredulously. The offer was certainly interesting, but no one believed that this idea would work out. There is already a large farm next door, and how could such a competitor be outdone? Finally, she reached the plot. Her husband wasn't home, and the flyer was taken by Natalie, the owner. And she was also shocked to hear from the red-haired girl, who, by the way, all presented to everyone a strange and beautiful name of Betty, that Julia offers to help with the repair of the roof, is ready to pay for the necessary building materials or the departure of a whole specialized team. Why such generosity? The landlady asked incredulously. "No, thank you. We do not need alms." "Wait." The red-haired girl jumped up like a scared squirrel. "It's not about charity. You see, that's the thing." And Julia's assistant explained that the Stones had always been in good standing with the deceased farmer, so there was no sense in changing their opinion of their reputation. She recalled that Jacob had once helped his best employees at no cost, and now, just the new landlady had decided to continue that tradition. The helper also relayed that Julia was very much looking forward to having the Stones help her with the big job of rebuilding the farm. Barry would take care of the machinery. Hope would join the bookkeeping. Natalie listened very carefully and then said that she and her husband would have to think about it. She was ready to agree to it right away, but it would not be dignified, so she took some time to think about it. John was also taking time to think, but only for quite different reasons. He just could not understand. And at what moment, in fact, his life turned in the wrong direction, when he decided not to sell his father's business right away, but to try to pull it out on his own, or when he started taking out one loan after another, desperate to hold on a little longer, in the blind hope that everything would work itself out. It was an amazingly strange feeling, but over the past few years, John's life had become noticeably emptier, and the things that used to make him happy no longer mattered. Brand name clothes, new gadgets, dinners at cool restaurants, nightclubs. It wasn't the same. And then it became inaccessible to him. John more and more often caught himself thinking that his days were passing aimlessly, that he existed as if in a vacuum, for himself alone. And it was not that bad, but he only needed himself to be happy. And it was strange that lately he was thinking of Julia more and more often. He had been regretting all these years, as if under the effect of an emotional avalanche, that he had left her. Yes, the girl was strange, completely inexperienced, but, after all, not only for that very thing in the wife take. What about her kindness, her natural charm, her lively mind? But he, an idiot, failed to see all this and disgraced the poor girl in front of the whole village, threw her out, brought her back to her mother, as if she were defective goods, and then, he knew that Julia had been sent to some distant relatives in the city, and even though the first sprouts of regret had already arisen, John had not dared to look for her. Why? It was clear how she felt about him now. He deserved it. And now Julia was back in his life. What a woman she had become. Words were inadequate. Emotions were overwhelming. But John held on. He gathered up the last shreds of pride and held on. Calmly, just a little haughty and certainly not showing that he cared about his ex-wife. He accepted Julia's terms that he could stay. He honestly began to fulfill his duties as her errand boy. No, she wasn't intentionally humiliating him. It wasn't in her nature at all. But she was making it clear how different they were now. And yet John hung in there. He helped to sort out the documentation of all the property, made sure that the hired workers plowed the field competently, and most importantly, correctly restored the greenhouses. In general, there was enough work there was no time to be sad and feel sorry for themselves. Winter was approaching, and from one day to the next all the work should be finished, and there a break until spring. No, in fact, there was enough work for the winter, because it was necessary to solve 1,000 issues in advance, for example, to choose seeds for sowing and in advance to start choosing who to sell the future crop. And yet, how difficult it was. One day, when the first snow was already falling from the sky, Julia came again. The girl had long ago given up the extra escort car with security guards for what? In many ways, she was ready to agree with her uncle, but this excessive imagination a little irritated her. True, usually she was not against the escort in the person of Alexander, but not this time. The thing was that their relationship had changed recently, and it was beginning to seem to Julia more and more that Alexander cared for her. And the worst of all was that she cared for him too. Julia thought she just wasn't ready for a relationship, because there's studying to be done. Work, just live. You don't have to do anything stupid. So she came alone this time. First of all, to visit my mom and grandparents. The old people were quite bad, tortured by chronic diseases, and Julia had to persuade them to agree to go to the city later for examination and treatment in a good private clinic. But with her mother, the communication was not so smooth. Selena, though in many ways had squandered her faith in all things mystical, but she didn't like the way her daughter had gotten close to Mickey. She didn't like the way Julia dressed too revealingly. Moreover, on her last visit, Selena had pissed Julia off by telling her that she'd seen Julia's father, Arnold. He's walking around pale and toothy. Mom, please, don't be crazy. Julia exclaimed and literally ran out of the house. What is this nonsense? It was clear to everyone Arnold was long gone in the world. This conversation must have stirred up her nerves so much that Julia suddenly felt the urgent need to talk to John about business matters. She knocked on the door of his house. He opened. At first, they talked normally about the planting season and pest control methods. But then John suddenly asked how she was, how was life? Julia, heated by the conversation with her mother, replied that everything was fine. Thanks to him, in time planted the idea of divorce. John also did not hold back and replied that if he was so disgusted with her, she would not talk to him, but would send a lawyer to negotiate. And that so far it looks like a hidden, disguised under the work together flirtation, because she is eager for him. What? Julia asked in shock. Are you out of your mind? Has everyone gone crazy today? That's what. You're the most insufferable person I've ever known. All right, you've done it. From now on, the only way we're gonna communicate is through my lawyers. And you're fired. Why would I be fired? John squinted at me. What did you do wrong? Everything, the girl exclaimed and jumped to her feet, running for the door. Ever since our first wedding night, everything has been wrong. Julia stopped in front of the car, threw back her head and stared up at the sky. Clear, studded with stars. You don't see such things in the city. She took a few deep breaths in and out. Calm down. She needed to calm down, and it would be better not to communicate with John personally anymore. As she turned onto the road leading from the village to the city, Julia finally regained her composure. She was about to turn on her favorite radio station so that she wouldn't doze off on the way. But then she noticed a man ahead of her. It was an old man, standing by the roadside and stretched out his arm to catch a hitchhiker. In general, Julia was not in the habit of picking up strangers, but this old man, she suddenly thought that it must be some lonely pensioner. How could she pass by without caring? Moreover, The storm was coming, one of the last of the autumn thunderstorms, which it seemed in this weather might well turn into a blizzard. "Good evening, Grandpa." Julia smiled amiably, pulling over and lowering the window. "Hello, hello," he said in a squeaky but surprisingly deep and velvety voice. Their eyes met, and there was something in his eyes that Julia instantly realized the danger. Her hand was already reaching to close the windows and her feet to the gas pedal, but the stranger was more nimble than her, and his hand with its gnarled, broken fingernails swept toward the girl, grabbed her by the hair, and pushed her head forward. The girl's face, and especially her nose, collided with the steering wheel. Immediately, it became difficult to breathe. She wanted to scream to resist, but her desperate battle lasted a couple of minutes because the old man, with unexpected for such a puny body agility and strength, has already opened the car door from the inside and now strangled Julia, while continuing to push her head repeatedly with the dashboard. And finally, the world for her fell into blackness. That night, when people dared to interrupt his ritual, Arnold thought that the great Prince of Darkness and his ancestor, Dracula, had abandoned his faithful servant. He thought he would perish. But the forces of darkness came to the rescue as he survived while wandering in the woods, in the swamps. And then, well, skills, cunning and fortitude, all this he had in abundance. So he cleverly managed to get lost among the outcast, that is the homeless, and so wait for some time. And then, of course, had to hide. Arnold thought that all his labors went to waste, but then he found out something. He learned that she was his beautiful virgin victim, had a child with him. And that was a sign that the rite would be completed. And then, then he would be richly rewarded. It remained only to wait. But waited these long years, Arnold was not in the guise of a bum. He was found by one of the faithful old helpers. I don't care about those milk suckers who came to the sect only for material benefits. This man was an old assistant, serving the future incarnation of Dracula for the sake of his faith itself. And they began to wait. And finally, Julia entered the age, which according to mystical calculations on onyx stones and animal bones, was best suited for the rite. It was only a matter of finding out where the girl was and choosing the right moment to capture her. When the foolish girl stopped on the road, the calculation was right. She was so merciful. When she stopped, Arnold was not alone. His faithful assistant was lurking in the bushes. Yes, it was not very dignified for the servants of darkness to play hide and seek like this and make a masquerade. But what could be done? The former magnitude was not available. But everything had to pay off more than enough after the ritual. "You want to reproach me for being a lousy husband?" John opened the door. He expected to see Julia there, but it was her familiar assistant, Betty. "Good evening," John said, losing his usual dashing attitude. "Something wrong?" It was easy to read the girl's face, eyes huge, breathing heavily. "Julia's car. I was here on business too. I had to decide something with the field, how it will be winterized." The girl explained confusedly. "And on the way back, I saw her car. On the road, the window was broken. Inside, Julia had been attacked. It looked like there was a struggle inside." "What?" John grabbed Betty by the shoulders. "Did you call for help?" "Yeah," she nodded. "But I came to you. Let's go check it out, shall we? By the time they get here, it'll be a while. Anything could happen to Julia in that time." Well, John didn't ponder for long, just grabbed his jacket from the coat rack and slipped his feet into his boots. On the run, they knocked to the other neighbors' stones, and Sam explained to them quickly what had happened, and soon all of them, in a crowd already, rushed to the road. The car was in place, and one look was enough to realize that something very bad had happened here. On the ground, Sam said, shining his flashlights on the sides. "Two men, probably. Here are the tracks. Well, it looks like they lead that way." And he pointed to a grove nearby. It was a small grove, but the trees and bushes were so dense that nothing could be seen from the side. And yet, resolutely, the whole group rushed forward. Initially, Arnold planned to drag the girl away and take her away in his automobile, which was hidden behind the grove. And at first, everything went as it should. He and his assistant dragged her together. But then, his assistant suddenly stopped, said, "I don't feel so good in my heart," and collapsed to the ground. Arnold was confused at first. Then he felt for a pulse. No pulse. He cursed. It seems that the forces of darkness had turned their backs on him if they had sent him such an ordeal. Arnold was quite strong for his age, but the years of wandering had not been in vain, and Julia weighed as much as a feather, so he realized at some point that he could not carry her any further. His back ached terribly, and Arnold remembered that in the heat of reverie about how he would perform the rite, he had forgotten to take painkillers. Oh, what a weak human body it was. Well, nothing. All that was left was to sacrifice the girl, and he would get a new body that would be as powerful as the one Dracula himself had once possessed. There was not much left, but suddenly Arnold heard a noise, and then, in the clearing where he stopped with his prey, suddenly people rushed out. "Who's that old stump?" Barry said. "Get away from her now." Arnold straightened up, spread his legs and spread his feet, and grinned. He had no teeth of his own, but he wore a false jaw, and he had bought a jaw with fangs like a real vampire's, especially for the ritual, which he believed with all his heart could and should have become any minute now. But once again, something went wrong. "Get away from her, you bastard!" Sam shouted at the strange grandfather and stepped forward, swung the paddle threateningly, seizing it as a means of self-defense. Well, or attack thought, as the case may be. "Fools, you can't stop the Prince of Darkness," Arnold shouted. The wind was getting stronger. The sky seemed quite low from behind the shaggy clouds, but there was no rain, no wet snow, no hail yet. "She belongs to me." Arnold stood dangerously close to Julia, who was prostrate on the ground, and that was why those who had discovered the girl did not dare to come closer, for they feared that the old man might have some weapon with which to harm her. "You can't stop me. I am the vessel for Dracula's coming." At one point Arnold coughed. "He's crazy," Barry said. At that moment, Julia on the ground moaned softly, and stirred the girl began to come out of a deep faint. "She belongs to me," shrieked Arnold again, and then froze confusedly, because he remembered the dagger and all the other artifacts for the ritual were left there in his and his assistant's car. "Don't you dare interfere with me," said Arnold menacingly, and tried to grab the girl again and drag her further. But then Sam, who had already assessed the situation, just threw the paddle on the ground, and then simply walked up to the old man and sent him to the ground with a powerful short blow to the jaw. "Rest, psychopath," Sam said, and bent down, picking Julia up in his arms. That's when the rest of the 10 villagers, as well as Betty and John, rushed over to the missing woman. And after a couple more minutes, everyone heard the sound of sirens. Fortunately, Julia was not badly hurt. She had only a lot of bumps and bruises, cuts, but in general her health was not threatened. And yet the girl was left in the hospital for a day. Arnold, when he was able to get up, did not even try to resist, only shouted that stupid people do not understand anything and the coming of Dracula in this world cannot be stopped. The psychiatrist who took him in almost immediately said that apparently he had finally developed schizophrenia. And it also became known that Arnold will probably now be placed in a clinic for the rest of his life. Arnold's assistant, as it turned out, died of a massive heart attack. A story that began more than 20 years ago has finally come to an end. However, much of it remained hidden from the inhabitants of Pompeii. Only John and Betty knew the whole truth. They were told about it by Mickey and Julia herself. Naturally, they were shocked by what they heard, but they promised and even swore that all this would remain between them. After all, it was clear that it was not necessary for all people to know about what had happened to Selena long ago, and it was not necessary for all people to know who Julia's father was. Yes, probably, many people would understand and would treat both women normally if they knew such things. And yet it was clear that it was better to keep some pages of the past closed. When Julia felt better, not mainly physically but emotionally, she wanted to talk to John. They met at Mickey's house. Julia said that first of all, she wanted to apologize for how unkind she had been to John at first when she came with the documents. "No, I'm the one who should apologize, and it remains to be seen if I should be forgiven," the boy smiled sadly. "That's what I did back then. I just can't believe I was capable of it. Our marriage and everything else. Maybe it's time for us to forget the past and start again." Julia asked and took his hand. John froze. He thought she was talking about. "No, I'm not talking about a romantic relationship. Julia laughed. Not at all. I actually already have someone. Alexander. He's my chauffeur and assistant, and now he's my fiancé, she said. That's good, John nodded. It's good that you were able to move in that direction. You're a wonderful girl, Julia. You're bound to be happy. You too, she smiled sincerely. Actually, I already have, John coughed. Betty and I. What? You and Betty? Julia's eyes widened. I never would have guessed. Well, we've been talking a lot lately, and then she asked me out on a date, and I've been hesitant to do it. I recognize Betty, Julia said. And then they talked some more about what to do about the household. They came to the conclusion that there was still plenty of room to return to the prosperity of Jacob's time. Julia offered Mickey a proper job as one of the managers. He accepted. He suddenly realized that this was his calling and destiny, to stay in Pompeii and do what his father had done. And John also somehow believed that the bad times were over for all of them and that only better things were ahead.